The land stretches before you like an ancient scroll unrolling across millennia, each crease and fold revealing stories written in stone, earth, and water. China's vast territories hold within them monuments to human ambition and natural grandeur that seem to exist outside ordinary time, suspended between the earthly realm and something far more eternal. To walk among these places is to move through layers of history so dense they become almost tangible, as if the very air carries whispers from dynasties long vanished. At the heart of Beijing stands the Forbidden City, a palace complex so vast and intricate that it seems less like a building and more like a city unto itself, a red and gold cosmos enclosed within vermilion walls. For nearly 5 centuries, this was the sanctum of emperors. It is a place where heaven and earth were believed to meet, where the Son of Heaven performed rituals that maintained the cosmic order. The scale alone defies easy comprehension. Nearly 1,000 buildings spread across 72 hectares, each structure positioned according to principles that honored celestial patterns and earthly harmony. Walking through the Meridian Gate, you pass beneath 5 openings, each designed for specific purposes, specific ranks. The central passage was reserved for the emperor alone, a man who ruled not merely by political authority, but by divine mandate. The architecture itself becomes a language of power and philosophy. Every golden roof tile, every carved dragon, every marble balustrade speaks of hierarchies, both human and cosmic. The halls rise in succession, each grander than the last, leading toward the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where the emperor sat enthroned beneath a ceiling adorned with a coiling dragon clutching a pearl. The craftsmanship, evident in every corner of the Forbidden City, represents generations of artisans working with skills passed down through centuries. The wooden structures stand without a single nail, joints fitted together with such precision that they've survived earthquakes and storms that leveled lesser buildings. The glazed tiles shimmer in sunlight, their golden hue created through techniques that required multiple firings, each one risky, each one demanding perfect timing and temperature. The painters who decorated the ceilings mixed their pigments from minerals and gems, creating colors that haven't faded even after hundreds of years, exposed to dust and smoke from countless incense burners. But the Forbidden City was more than architecture. It was theater, ceremony, a carefully choreographed demonstration of imperial authority. Every morning, officials would gather in the vast courtyards, arranging themselves by rank, waiting for the emperor to appear. The sound of their silk robes rustling across marble must have been like a whispered symphony. The entire complex was designed to inspire awe, to make anyone who entered feel small before the grandeur of imperial power. Yet within these formal spaces existed gardens where empresses and concubines walked among ancient pines and strange rocks, where water trickled through artificial streams, creating pockets of tranquility within the rigid formality. Travel westward from Beijing, across plains and through mountain passes, and you eventually reach Xi'an, once called Chang'an, capital of dynasties that shaped Chinese civilization when Rome was still expanding across Europe. Here, beneath farmland that had been plowed and planted for generations, archaeologists discovered something that defied belief. In 1974, farmers digging a well-struck pottery fragments that led to one of the 20th century's most astonishing archaeological finds, the Terracotta army of Emperor Qin Shi Huang. Descending into the excavation pits is like entering an underground realm where time stopped over 2,000 years ago. Row upon row of life-sized warriors stand in battle formation, each face unique, each figure embodying the individuality of actual soldiers. Like the emperor who ordered their creation was the man who first unified China's warring states, who standardized weights, measures, and writing, who built the earliest version of the Great Wall. He was a ruler of tremendous ambition and equal paranoia, a man who sought immortality through elixirs of mercury that probably hastened his death. These terracotta soldiers were meant to protect him in the afterlife, an army that would never tire, never rebel, never age. The sheer scope of the project reveals both the emperor's power and his fear. Estimates suggest over 700,000 laborers worked on his tomb complex, which extends far beyond the excavated pits currently visible. Most of the tomb remains unexcavated, including the burial chamber itself. which ancient texts describe as containing rivers of mercury and a ceiling studded with pearls to represent stars. Each warrior was created using an assembly process that combined mass production with individual artistry. Bodies were made from molds, but hands, heads, and details were crafted individually. Originally, they were painted in bright colors, each soldier wearing the pigments appropriate to his rank and unit. When exposed to air after burial for millennia, these colors flaked away within minutes, vanishing before archaeologists could develop preservation techniques. Now the warriors stand in earth-toned dignity, their terracotta clay revealing the marks where ancient artisans smoothed surfaces and carved details. Looking at their faces, you see expressions that range from stern determination to youthful uncertainty. Some warriors have broad, weathered features suggesting men from northern steppes. Others display more refined southern characteristics. They represent the diversity of an empire drawn from many regions, many peoples. There are infantry soldiers and archers, cavalry and charioteers, generals and common troops. Each figure stands as testament to the individuals who modeled for them, farmers and hunters who served their time in the emperor's army, and then returned to fields and forests, never knowing they would be immortalized in clay. The terracotta warriors speak to something fundamental about Chinese civilization. The belief that order must be maintained even beyond death, that the structures of earthly power extend into spiritual realms. They represent an emperor's desire to control the uncontrollable, to bring military precision to the mysteries of the afterlife. Yet there's something deeply human in their creation too. The artisans who shaped them left fingerprints in the clay, marks that archaeologists can still identify. These anonymous craftsmen reached across millennia to touch us, their small gestures of individual expression surviving within a project designed to glorify imperial might. From Xi'an, the Great Wall calls, stretching across northern China like a stone dragon following the contours of mountains and valleys. To stand upon this structure is to feel the weight of history pressing against your chest. The wall you see today, the restored sections with their elegant watchtowers and smooth pathways, represents primarily Ming Dynasty construction from the 14th through 17th centuries. But walls had been built here for over 2,000 years before that, each dynasty adding, rebuilding, extending the barriers meant to keep out northern invaders. The Great Wall isn't really a single wall at all, but a network of fortifications, some running parallel, others branching off, creating a defensive system that stretched over 13,000 miles at its greatest extent. Parts were built from rammed earth, others from wood and stone. The most impressive sections, the ones tourists visit today, feature brick and stone construction of extraordinary precision. Bricks were made in kilns and carried up steep mountain slopes by workers whose labor and lives were consumed by this endless project. Walking along the wall at Badaling or Mutianyu, you climb steps so steep they seem designed for giants. The wall follows ridgelines, rising and falling with the terrain, sometimes clinging to slopes so precipitous you wonder how builders managed to place each stone. Watchtowers appear at regular intervals, positioned to allow smoke signals to relay messages across vast distances. From one tower, soldiers could see the next, creating a communication network that could transmit warnings from frontier to capital in hours. But the wall's significance extends beyond military function. It marked a boundary between civilizations, between the settled agricultural society of China proper and the nomadic peoples of the steppes. It represented a psychological barrier as much as a physical one, a statement that here civilization ended and barbarism began. Of course, that boundary was always porous. Trade flowed across it. People moved in both directions. Nomadic dynasties eventually conquered China and ruled from Beijing. The wall couldn't truly separate cultures that were always intertwined. Standing atop the Great Wall as mist rises from valleys below, you can imagine the soldiers who garrisoned these remote posts. They spent years far from home, scanning horizons for raiders who might never come, enduring bitter winters when snow buried the pathways and rations ran short. Many died here, their bones mixed into the mortar, their names forgotten. Local legends claim the wall is haunted by their spirits, that on quiet nights you can hear footsteps echoing along empty battlements. The wall's construction consumed resources on a scale that beggars imagination. Entire forests were cut to fire the kilns that baked bricks. Quarries were exhausted. so the human cost can never be truly calculated. Poets wrote laments about wives waiting for husbands who died building these fortifications. The wall became a symbol of tyranny in folk stories, particularly those about Qin Shi Huang, the same emperor whose terracotta army stands eternal guard in Xi'an. One famous legend tells of Meng Jiangnu, whose husband died during wall construction. She wept so bitterly that part of the wall collapsed, revealing his bones, so she could give him proper burial. Yet despite the suffering woven into its stones, the Great Wall stands as an extraordinary achievement of human determination and engineering. It showcases ancient Chinese capabilities in organizing massive labor forces, in solving construction challenges posed by difficult terrain, in creating structures meant to last for centuries. The modern sections have stood for over 600 years, surviving earthquakes and weathering that would have destroyed lesser buildings. Traveling south from the northern barriers and battlements, the landscape transforms. Mountains give way to gentler hills, then to the fertile plains and waterways of the Yangtze River Basin. Here you find Hangzhou and its jewel, West Lake, a place celebrated in poetry and painting for over 1,000 years. The lake itself is modest in size, less than 6 square kilometers, but its cultural resonance far exceeds its physical dimensions. West Lake has been shaped by human hands as much as by nature. Causeways divide its waters, creating distinct sections, each with its own character. The Su Causeway, built during the Song dynasty by the poet official Su Dongpo, runs across the lake's western edge, lined with willows and crossed by graceful bridges. The Bai Causeway honors another poet official from the Tang dynasty. These weren't merely transportation routes, but carefully designed landscapes meant to frame views, to create scenes that would inspire artistic contemplation. Walking along these paths in early morning as mist hovers over the water, you enter a world that seems to have escaped from a classical painting. Willow branches trail into still water. Lotus flowers emerge from broad leaves. Small boats drift past, their oars creating gentle ripples. Mountains rise in the distance, their peaks sometimes hidden by clouds. The scene possesses a quality of timeless serenity, as if this place exists outside the ordinary flow of hours and days. Throughout Chinese history, West Lake has represented an ideal of natural beauty harmonizing with human culture. Emperors built pavilions along its shores. Poets composed verses praising its seasonal transformations. Painters attempted to capture its subtle moods, the way light changes across water, the delicate colors of dawn and dusk. The lake became associated with romantic legends, particularly the story of the White Snake, a spirit who took human form and fell in love with a mortal man, their doomed romance playing out against this beautiful backdrop. The lake's beauty comes partly from its cultivated imperfection. This isn't nature left wild, nor is it completely dominated by human construction. Instead, it represents a careful balance, an aesthetic that values suggestion over statement, emptiness over fullness. A single pavilion on a small island becomes a focal point that organizes the entire view. A moon gate frames distant mountains, transforming them into living paintings. The overall effect teaches patience, encourages contemplation, invites you to slow down and observe subtle changes. Different seasons bring different moods to West Lake. Spring arrives with peach blossoms coloring the shores pink and white. Summer brings lotus flowers blooming across water surfaces. Autumn brings mists that soften edges and create atmospheric depth. Winter occasionally brings snow, transforming the landscape into a monochrome study in black ink and white paper. Each transformation has inspired countless poems, each trying to capture something essential about the lake's character that nevertheless remains elusive, just beyond words. And the 10 classic scenic spots around West Lake have been celebrated for centuries. There's the lotus flowers at Kyuan Garden, the moon reflected in 3 pools, the snow on the broken bridge, the evening bell from Nanping Mountain. These scenes became so famous that other cities created their own versions, attempting to replicate West Lake's aesthetic achievements. But the original retains something unreproducible, perhaps because its beauty is inseparable from its history, from the layers of cultural meaning accumulated across dynasties. Standing beside Westlake at dusk, as lights begin to appear along the distant shore, you understand why this place has haunted Chinese imagination for so long. It offers refuge from the harsh realities of political intrigue and warfare that marked much of Chinese history. Here, for a moment, beauty and peace seemed possible. Exiled officials found consolation in composing poems about willow branches and moonlit water. Artists sought to capture eternal truths in the play of light across rippling surfaces. But China's wonders extend far beyond what human hands have built or shaped. The land itself rises toward the sky in mountain ranges that define the word majestic. The Himalayas form a wall along China's southwestern border, their peaks piercing clouds, their slopes challenging anyone who dares approach. Among these giants stands Everest, known in Chinese as Chomolungma, mother goddess of the world, a mountain sacred to Tibetan Buddhism and irresistible to mountaineers from around the globe. The Chinese side of Everest presents a different face than the more commonly climbed Nepali route. The north face rises in a pyramid of rock and ice, technically demanding, exposed to brutal winds that roar across the Tibetan plateau. The base camp on the Chinese side sits at over 5,000 meters, a place where altitude makes every breath feel insufficient, where your body struggles to function in air so thin it can barely sustain human life. To approach Everest from Tibet is to journey through landscapes that feel otherworldly. The plateau stretches endlessly, vast and desolate, punctuated by turquoise lakes and distant mountains. Prayer flags snap in constant wind, their colors fading under intense ultraviolet light. Monasteries cling to impossible slopes, their walls thick against cold, their interiors rich with butter lamps and ancient statues. This is a land where the physical and spiritual worlds seem to overlap. Say where every mountain is sacred, every pass protected by deities who must be honored. Looking up at Everest's summit from the Tibetan plateau, watching the plume of snow stream from the peak like a banner, you realize that this is where earth meets sky in the most elemental way. The mountain rises from the landscape not as an intrusion, but as its culmination, the logical conclusion of all those folded ranges stretching westward. Local people call it Chomolungma, goddess mother of the world, and standing here it's easy to understand why. There's a quality to the light at this altitude that seems otherworldly, a clarity that makes distant objects appear sharp and close while also revealing their true scale. The air is thin enough that every movement requires deliberate effort, that breathing becomes something you have to think about rather than an automatic function. The region around the mountain contains ecosystems found nowhere else, adapted to extremes that would seem incompatible with life. Blue sheep navigate slopes so steep they appear vertical, their hooves gripping stone with precision that defies gravity. Snow leopards move through this terrain like ghosts, rarely seen but always present. Apex predators in a realm where even breathing presents challenges. The vegetation clings low to the ground, miniature rhododendrons and cushion plants that bloom briefly when conditions allow, their flowers bright against gray stone. These are survivors in the truest sense, life forms that have found ways to exist where existence seems impossible. Moving northeast from the Tibetan highlands, the landscape transitions into the vast grasslands of Inner Mongolia, a different kind of infinity. Here the horizon stretches unbroken in every direction, grassland rolling like ocean swells, interrupted only by occasional herds of horses whose manes stream in the perpetual wind. The sky overhead seems larger somehow, as if the absence of vertical interruption allows it to expand beyond normal dimensions. This is where nomadic traditions persist, where yurts still dot the landscape seasonally, where the relationship between people and land remains immediate and unmediated by urban complexity. The grasslands have their own rhythms, greening in spring, golden in autumn, white in winter when snow covers everything, and survival depends on preparation and knowledge passed down through generations. The Mongolian people who live here maintain connections to their ancestral ways, even as modern life encroaches, still moving with their herds, still singing the long songs that sound like the wind itself made audible. There's a particular kind of silence here during certain times of day, when even the wind pauses, and the only sound is the distant bell worn by a led animal, carrying across miles of empty space. Further east, where the grasslands begin to transition into more settled agricultural regions, the land tells stories of ancient exchanges between nomadic and sedentary cultures. The boundaries between these zones have shifted countless times throughout history, their fluctuations driven by climate, politics, military power, and the eternal negotiation between different ways of organizing human life. Towns and cities in these transitional zones reflect these competing influences, their architecture mixing Chinese gates with Mongolian decorative elements, their populations blending different ancestries and traditions. The city of Hohhot sits in this borderland, its old quarter containing Buddhist temples that speak to Tibetan influence, its newer sections stretching toward modernity while attempting to maintain some connection to heritage. The museums here house artifacts that span millennia, from Neolithic pottery to ornate saddles used by cavalry units that once dominated these plains. Standing in these collections, you can trace the movement of peoples, the spread of technologies, the exchange of artistic motifs that happened along these ancient frontiers. In the western reaches of the country, beyond the plateau and the grasslands, lie the desert basins that once hosted crucial segments of the Silk Road. The Taklamakan Desert spreads across the Tarim Basin, its name sometimes translated as the place from which one doesn't return, a repository of buried cities and forgotten kingdoms. The dunes here reach impressive heights, their ridges sharp against blue sky, their surfaces sculpted by wind into patterns that shift constantly. At the desert's edges, oasis towns survive on glacier meltwater from distant mountains, their populations maintaining traditions that blend Central Asian, Islamic, and Chinese influences in unique combinations. Cities like Kashgar have served as crossroads for over 2,000 years, their bazaars still operating in spaces that ancestors would recognize, and selling goods that have traveled through mountain passes from neighboring countries. The old town, though partially rebuilt, retains the feel of a Central Asian city, its buildings made of mud brick, its streets narrow and winding, designed for pedestrians and pack animals rather than vehicles. The Idkar Mosque dominates the main square, its yellow facade and minarets marking this as firmly part of the Islamic architectural tradition, though adapted to local materials and conditions. The Silk Road wasn't a single route, but a network of paths, changing according to season, politics, and the availability of water. Caravans would follow these routes for months, carrying silk westward and bringing back jade, horses, glassware, and ideas. The oasis towns that supported this trade became cosmopolitan centers where merchants from different regions mingled, where religious and philosophical concepts were exchanged along with physical goods. Buddhist monks traveling from India to China used these routes, establishing monasteries along the way, translating sutras, and creating the foundations for Chinese Buddhism. The Mogao Caves near Dunhuang represent one of the most impressive remainders of this cultural exchange. Carved into a cliff face over the course of a millennium, these caves contain Buddhist art spanning different dynasties and stylistic periods. The earlier caves show clear Indian influence in their sculpture and painting techniques, while later ones develop distinctly Chinese characteristics. The famous Library Cave, sealed in the 11th century and rediscovered only in 1900, contained thousands of manuscripts in multiple languages, providing scholars with unprecedented insights into medieval life along the Silk Road. Walking through these caves today, even with many of the best murals protected behind locked doors to preserve them from light and humidity, you can sense the devotion that created them. The painted Buddhas and Bodhisattvas gaze out with expressions of serene compassion, their hands positioned in mudras that convey specific meanings, their surroundings filled with celestialians, flying apsaras, and geometric patterns that seem to dance across the curved ceilings. The pigments were made from ground minerals, some imported from great distances, and they retain their vibrancy after centuries in darkness. And the surrounding landscape adds to the site's otherworldly quality. The caves open onto a river valley bordered by sand dunes that climb toward distant mountains. The contrast between the decorated cave interiors and the stark desert outside seems to embody the Buddhist concept of finding enlightenment within the material world. Nearby, the remains of ancient watchtowers and defensive walls mark where military garrisons once protected this strategic location, where the Chinese Empire extended its reach westward to secure trade routes and defend against incursions. Returning eastward across northern China, The landscape gradually shifts from desert to grassland to agricultural plains, each zone supporting different forms of settlement and economic activity. The Yellow River flows through these regions, its muddy waters giving it the name that has stuck for millennia. This river has shaped Chinese civilization as much as any human dynasty, its floods and course changes affecting millions of people, its water enabling agriculture in regions that would otherwise support only sparse populations. The lowest plateau through which the Yellow River cuts contains some of the thickest deposits of wind-blown soil on Earth, accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years. This yellow earth is incredibly fertile but also highly erodible, and the river carries enormous quantities of sediment downstream, depositing it in the lower reaches and raising the riverbed higher with each flood cycle. Throughout history, managing this river has been a central challenge for Chinese governments, requiring massive labor mobilization to build and maintain dikes, to dredge channels, to attempt to control a natural force that resists permanent control. The communities along the Yellow River have adapted their architecture to local conditions, creating distinctive dwelling styles. In some areas, people carved homes directly into the low-S cliffs, creating cave houses that provide excellent insulation against both summer heat and winter cold. These homes can be surprisingly spacious inside, with multiple rooms carved from the earth, their facades built up with brick to create proper walls and windows. Walking through villages of these dwellings, you see how architecture can be literally carved from landscape, how shelter can be created by subtraction rather than addition. Moving further east into the Central Plains, you enter regions that have been intensively cultivated for thousands of years, where almost every piece of arable land has been shaped by human effort. The villages here are built from whatever materials are locally available, from fired brick to rammed earth, their layouts following patterns established long ago. Ancestral halls anchor these settlements, spaces where extended families gather to honor their predecessors, to maintain genealogical records, to perform rituals that connect present generations to those who came before. The agricultural landscapes themselves are works of human artistry, fields divided with geometric precision, water management systems channeling rainfall and river water to where it's needed, crops rotating through seasons in patterns refined through centuries of experience. Rice paddies in the southern regions create mirror surfaces during certain times of year, reflecting sky and clouds, the green shoots emerging in perfectly spaced rows. Terraced hillsides climb slopes that seem too steep for cultivation, each level held in place by stone walls that represent generations of labor, each terrace catching rainwater and preventing erosion. The Li River region in Guangxi province showcases this agricultural artistry against a backdrop of karst peaks that rise dramatically from relatively flat valley floors. The landscape here has inspired painters for over 1,000 years, its combination of strange rock formations, winding river, and cultivated fields creating scenery that seems too perfect to be natural. Bamboo groves cluster along the riverbanks, their stalks growing in dense stands, their leaves rustling in any breeze. Water buffalo stand in the shallows during hot afternoons, their presence adding to the timeless quality of scenes that haven't fundamentally changed in appearance despite centuries of political and social transformation. The karst formations themselves are limestone that has been dissolved and eroded by slightly acidic rainwater over millions of years. What remains are the most resistant sections, creating peaks and towers that rise abruptly, their sides often sheer, their tops sometimes supporting small ecosystems isolated from the surrounding lowlands. Caves penetrate many of these formations, some small and shallow, others extending for miles underground, their interiors decorated with stalactites and stalagmites in fantastic shapes. These caves have served various purposes throughout history, from shelter to storage to spaces for religious practice. Traditional fishing methods on the Li River include the use of cormorants, birds trained to catch fish and return them to the boat. The fishermen place rings around the birds' necks to prevent them from swallowing the larger fish, a technique that has been practiced here for over 1,000 years. Watching these fishermen work from narrow bamboo rafts, moving with practiced balance, communicating with their birds through sounds and gestures, you witness a skill set that connects directly to the past, that hasn't been entirely replaced by modern fishing techniques. The region's towns and villages contain architecture adapted to the humid subtropical climate, with high ceilings, wide eaves to provide shade and protection from heavy rains, and ventilation designed to encourage airflow. The Dong people, an ethnic minority in this region, are particularly known for their wooden architecture, including distinctive drum towers and wind and rain bridges. These bridges serve practical functions, allowing people to cross streams without getting wet, while also providing community gathering spaces. Their construction uses complex joinery that requires no nails, massive wooden beams fitted together with precision that speaks to sophisticated carpentry knowledge. Moving south toward the coast, you reach regions that have long been oriented toward maritime trade as well as agriculture. The port cities here have been gateways for foreign influence, places where traders from Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, and eventually Europe established communities and conducted business. The architecture reflects these influences, with buildings showing design elements imported from abroad, adapted to local conditions, and blended with indigenous styles. Fujian province contains remarkable examples of this cultural blending, particularly in the Tulu structures built by the Hakka people. These are communal living buildings, typically circular or square, with thick earthen walls that provide defense and privacy while surrounding a central courtyard. A single Tulu might house an entire clan, with dozens of families living in individual units arranged around the perimeter, sharing common spaces and resources. The largest of these buildings can be 4 or 5 stories tall, their walls several meters thick at the base, constructed from a mixture of earth, sand, lime, and bamboo reinforcement. Standing in the central courtyard of one of these structures, looking up at the ring of rooms rising around you, you experience a unique architectural environment. The buildings are oriented to cardinal directions, their internal layout following feng shui principles, their construction techniques representing accumulated knowledge about how to create durable structures from local materials. Many Tulu are several centuries old, still occupied by descendants of their builders, still functioning as intended despite having survived wars, natural disasters, and social upheavals. The coastal regions developed their own distinct cultures, shaped by the sea's opportunities and dangers. Fishing communities built their settlements right at the water's edge, their boats pulled up on beaches or moored in natural harbors, their livelihoods dependent on understanding tides, currents, weather patterns, and fish behavior. The Mazu temples, found throughout coastal areas, honor a deified girl who became the patron goddess of sailors, her worship spreading wherever Chinese maritime communities established themselves. These temples are often built in prominent locations overlooking the water, their architecture incorporating symbols of protection and good fortune. The historical tension between land-based and maritime orientations in Chinese civilization is reflected in the coastal regions. While agriculture remained the foundation of the economy for most of Chinese history, maritime trade was often viewed with suspicion by Confucian officials who valued stability over the uncertainties of commerce. Yet the economic opportunities provided by sea trade proved irresistible, and coastal regions often became wealthy and cosmopolitan despite official ambivalence or sometimes outright prohibition of maritime activity. Island communities off the coast developed their own unique characteristics, influenced by but distinct from mainland culture. Hainan Island in the far south has been described as a place of exile throughout much of history, somewhere officials were sent as punishment. Yet it also became home to diverse populations, including indigenous Lai people, whose tattooing traditions and textile arts set them apart from Han Chinese norms. The island's tropical climate allowed different crops than those grown on the mainland, including coconuts, pineapples, and rubber trees introduced in modern times. The South China Sea region served as a crucial link in maritime trade networks stretching from East Asia to Southeast Asia to the Indian Ocean. Ports along this coast handled goods from throughout the region and beyond, their warehouses storing silk, tea, porcelain, and other products destined for foreign markets, while receiving spices, ivory, precious woods, and other imports. The merchant families that controlled this trade often became enormously wealthy, commissioning temples, endowing schools, and building mansions that showcased their success. Returning to the interior, the mountain ranges that cross much of China from east to west created barriers that shaped regional development. The Qinling Mountains, which separate the Yellow River Basin from the Yangtze River Basin, mark a significant climatic and cultural boundary. North of these mountains, the climate is drier and cooler. Wheat rather than rice is the staple crop, and historical connections to northern peoples created distinct cultural patterns. South of the mountains, increased rainfall supports rice cultivation, the growing season is longer, and cultural orientations tended more toward the south and southeast. These mountains haven't been impassable, of course. Trails and eventually roads cross them at various points, allowing trade and communication between north and south. The difficulties of mountain travel meant that these crossings were strategic points, often fortified and controlled, places where goods could be taxed and suspicious travelers questioned. The mountains themselves supported populations who exploited forest resources, growing medicinal herbs, harvesting wood, hunting game, and maintaining a way of life somewhat apart from lowland agricultural societies. Temple complexes in remote mountain locations became destinations for pilgrims seeking spiritual advancement or healing. The journey to these places was itself considered spiritually significant, the physical difficulty of the trip serving as a form of devotion. Mountains have long held special status in Chinese culture, seen as homes of immortals, as places where the boundary between earthly and heavenly realms grows thin. The 5 sacred mountains of Taoism and the 4 sacred mountains of Buddhism became major pilgrimage destinations, their trails worn smooth by centuries of visitors, their peaks crowned with temples and shrines. Mount Tai in Shandong province holds particular significance as the most revered of the 5 sacred mountains. Emperors performed sacrificial ceremonies here to proclaim their mandate to rule, climbing the thousands of stone steps to the summit to conduct rituals that connected earthly authority to cosmic order. The mountain path is lined with stone inscriptions carved by visitors over millennia, poems and prayers and declarations that create a kind of vertical history book readable by anyone who makes the climb. Reaching the summit at dawn, watching the sun rise from the eastern sea, you participate in an experience that has been repeated countless times, that connects you to an unbroken chain of pilgrims stretching back thousands of years. The stone inscriptions throughout China's mountains and sacred sites represent a distinctive cultural practice, the impulse to leave words in permanent form at meaningful locations. These range from simple names and dates to elaborate philosophical statements, from official proclamations to personal poetry. The practice reflects Confucian values about literacy and the permanence of written language, but also something more fundamental, the human desire to mark significant places, to say I was here, to contribute to the accumulated record of human presence in landscape. The relationship between Chinese culture and its landscapes has always been reciprocal, each shaping the other. The land provided resources and challenges that influenced how societies developed, while human activity transformed landscapes through agriculture, construction, and resource extraction. The ideal relationship, as expressed in classical philosophy and art, involved harmony between human needs and natural processes, an understanding that long-term prosperity required working with rather than against natural systems. This ideal was not always achieved, of course. Deforestation, erosion, pollution, and over-exploitation of resources have occurred throughout Chinese history, though the scale of these problems has increased dramatically in modern times. The awareness of environmental degradation and its consequences has ancient roots, however, with scholars and officials throughout history advocating for conservation measures and sustainable practices. The concept of feng shui, while often dismissed as superstition, contains elements of practical environmental wisdom about building placement, water management, and maintaining balance between different landscape elements. Classical Chinese gardens represent one expression of this ideal relationship between human creativity and natural forms. Unlike formal European gardens with their geometric layouts and controlled topiary, Chinese gardens aim to recreate natural landscapes in miniature to capture the essence of mountains, forests, and streams in confined urban spaces. The rocks in these gardens weren't just decorative, but carefully selected for their shapes and textures, arranged to suggest larger formations. Water features weren't simply ornamental, but designed to sound like natural streams, to reflect sky and vegetation, to create the illusion of greater depth and distance. The gardens of Suzhou are particularly renowned for their sophistication and artistry. Created by wealthy officials and merchants over centuries, these private retreats compress natural beauty into spaces that might measure only a fraction of an acre. Every view was carefully composed, with buildings, rocks, plants, and water arranged so that moving through the garden revealed constantly changing perspectives. Windows and doorways were designed to frame specific scenes, creating living paintings that changed with seasons and weather. The gardens contained libraries and studios where owners could read, write poetry, paint, practice calligraphy, and entertain friends, all while surrounded by carefully crafted natural beauty. The plants in these gardens were chosen for their symbolic meanings as well as their aesthetic qualities. Bamboo represented flexibility and resilience, its ability to bend without breaking, making it a model for the ideal scholarly temperament. Plum blossoms symbolized perseverance and hope, blooming in late winter before other flowers dared to emerge. Peonies represented wealth and honor, their lush flowers embodying abundance and beauty. Lotus flowers, rising from mud to bloom, clean above the water, illustrated Buddhist concepts about transcending material circumstances to achieve spiritual purity. The rocks in Chinese gardens deserve particular attention, as they became objects of connoisseurship and aesthetic contemplation in their own right. The most prized rocks came from Lake Tai, their limestone surfaces eroded by water into fantastic shapes full of holes, wrinkles, and protrusions. Large rocks might be worth tremendous sums, transported over long distances to be installed in gardens where they served as abstract sculptures, objects for meditation and appreciation. The ideal rock exhibited qualities described as lean, wrinkled, holed, and ugly, though ugly here meant interesting and unpredictable rather than unpleasant to look at. This appreciation for rocks extended beyond gardens to collecting smaller specimens, called scholars' rocks, which were displayed in studios and libraries. These pieces of naturally formed stone would be mounted on wooden stands and contemplated as miniature mountains, their surfaces and contours suggesting vast landscapes compressed into objects small enough to hold in one hand. The practice reflected broader aesthetic principles that valued natural forms over artificial perfection, that found beauty in asymmetry and irregularity, that saw deeper meanings in seemingly simple objects. The artistic traditions developed in China over millennia created distinctive approaches to representing both landscape and human experience. Chinese landscape painting, which reached its highest development during the Song dynasty, it wasn't primarily concerned with accurate topographical representation, but with capturing the spiritual essence of natural scenes. Mountains weren't depicted simply as geological formations, but as embodiments of cosmic principles, their peaks reaching toward heaven, their presence suggesting permanence and stability. Water represented change and flow, its movement contrasting with the solidity of rock and earth. The painters who created these works often included themselves as tiny figures within vast landscapes, humans reduced to scale by the immensity of natural forces surrounding them. This wasn't meant to diminish human significance, but to place it in proper context, to suggest that wisdom came from understanding one's relationship to larger patterns and processes. The best paintings invited viewers to imagine themselves walking through the depicted landscapes, following paths that led into distant mountains, crossing bridges over rushing streams, climbing toward temples half hidden in mist. The use of mist and empty space in these paintings served multiple purposes. Practically, it allowed artists to suggest depth and atmosphere while leaving much to the viewer's imagination. Philosophically, it reflected Taoist concepts about the importance of emptiness and void, the recognition that what isn't present is as important as what is, that fullness and emptiness define each other. The spaces left unpainted in a landscape scroll weren't failures to fill the surface, but deliberate choices that created breathing room, that prevented the composition from feeling crowded or exhausting. Calligraphy, perhaps even more than painting, was considered the highest visual art in Chinese culture. The act of writing with brush and ink on paper or silk required years of practice to master, developing control and spontaneity simultaneously. The great calligraphers created characters that balanced structure with freedom, that followed established forms while expressing individual personality. Calligraphy was seen as revealing the writer's inner character, their moral cultivation visible in how they handled the brush, in the rhythm and flow of their writing. The tools of calligraphy became objects of appreciation themselves. Brushes were made from various animal hairs, each type creating different effects, their handles fashioned from bamboo, wood, or precious materials. Ink was ground fresh for each writing session. An ink stick rubbed against an inkstone with water until the desired consistency was achieved. The process of preparing to write was meditative, a way of focusing the mind before attempting to create. The paper or silk used had to be of appropriate quality, its surface neither too absorbent nor too resistant, its texture contributing to the final appearance of the characters. The four treasures of the scholar's studio, the brush, ink stick, inkstone, and paper, were subjects of connoisseurship and collection. Inkstones in particular could be extremely valuable, carved from specific types of stone prized for their texture and aesthetic qualities. Some stones were simple and functional, while others were elaborately carved with landscapes, animals, or symbolic motifs. The best stones would be used for generations, by developing a patina from years of ink grinding, becoming repositories of artistic history. The integration of writing and visual art in Chinese culture meant that paintings often included inscriptions, poems, or commentary written directly on the image. Later viewers might add their own inscriptions, creating layered works that accumulated meaning over time. A painting might contain the original artist's signature and seal, plus poems by friends who saw it, plus colophons by later collectors, each edition becoming part of the work's history and significance. These inscriptions weren't seen as defacing the original, but as enriching it, as creating a dialogue across generations about art and its meanings. The tradition of mounting paintings and calligraphy as hanging scrolls or hand scrolls influenced how they were experienced. Hanging scrolls would be displayed seasonally or for special occasions, stored carefully at other times, creating a rhythm of viewing that prevented familiarity from breeding indifference. Hand scrolls were even more intimate, designed to be unrolled gradually while seated at a table, revealing their contents section by section, the viewer controlling the pace and direction of revelation. This sequential viewing meant that hand scrolls could tell stories or show journeys, taking advantage of their horizontal format to create narrative progression. The architectural and natural wonders of China ultimately form a single interconnected narrative about human civilization's long engagement with a particular landscape. Each site, whether built or natural, contains layers of meaning accumulated through history, poetry, painting, and the countless individual experiences of people who visited them. The physical structures and landscapes persist while the people who created or viewed them have disappeared. Yet something of their vision and values remains embedded in stone, wood, earth, and water. Standing in these places today, you become part of this continuing story. The Forbidden City's courtyards still convey imperial grandeur even without emperors. The Terracotta warriors still guard their tomb, though the emperor they served is long dead. The Great Wall still snakes across mountains, though the threats it defended against have vanished. West Lake still offers serenity despite surrounding urban development. Everest still rises above the plateau, indifferent to human history. These places outlast individual lives and often outlast civilizations, and maintaining presence and significance across vast stretches of time. They remind us that human efforts can create lasting beauty and meaning, that our relationship with landscape and built environment shapes culture in profound ways, that the past remains accessible through places that preserve its material traces and continue to inspire wonder in those who take time to truly see them.